Okay, what do you think? This is your welcome. Is it loud enough? I don't think so. Ladies and gentlemen, I still don't think it's loud enough. First of all, God forbid you should stop eating while I'm talking. Please, keep eating. I really mean that, actually. You barely had a chance to sit and eat, so sit and eat because we know people are more generous when full. It's an old Talmudic saying. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Sinai Temple and to an evening of Elnet, which will be, I hope, an evening of learning and also of community in what is a difficult time, and particularly today was a very painful day for the Jewish people. And we will speak more about that in a moment. But I think what I'm going to ask you to do is before the anthems, and we welcome Rabbi Sherman, who is the senior rabbi of Sinai Temple. Before the anthems, I'm going to ask everyone to rise for a moment of silence for the Bibas family, for the other families who have been bereaved, for the hostages, for the soldiers who have perished defending our land, and all those who have suffered unbelievable depredations and pain in the past year. Dear God, we pray for healing on our land and our people. May you return all those who are still in captivity speedily, and may we begin the process of healing and growing and moving into, God willing, a better future than this year that we have passed. Please stay standing for the national anthem and for Hatikva.
And I understand we have the director of Elnet, Joan Ryan, from the United Kingdom. So we're going to add the national anthem of the United Kingdom today as well. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in and gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King, send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King. Kol hod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiya ulfate mizrach kadima ayin letzion tzofia עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו, התקווה בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. You may be seated. Sorry, that was the rabbi's job.
First, I want to say on behalf of our musical director, Benjamin Fingerhut, we hired him 2 years ago from the United Kingdom. And we said in 2 years, we want to make sure that you remember your national anthem, so it's beautiful that he was here tonight. On behalf of the Sinai Temple clergy, myself, co-senior rabbi, Rabbi Nicole Guzik, we are truly honored to welcome Elnet. It's wonderful to see Larry Hochberg this evening. And even though he's not here, Tom Flesh, who was instrumental in bringing this event and tomorrow event. Make sure you tell your family and friends that to join us tomorrow for the part 2 of this wonderful evening. And also of the Flesh Family Sinai Temple Israel Center, which under the banners of culture, advocacy, travel, and education, make a difference not only here at Sinai Temple, but also within the Los Angeles Jewish community, the greater United States, and also in the land of Israel. So thank you for being here this evening. Rebecca? Yeah, can we, it's bleeding over from that, sorry. There's always prayers everywhere. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed panel. I'm going to begin with the friend of Sinai Temple. I don't say former Sinai Temple member, but always a Sinai Temple member, Ambassador David Siegel, Chief of Staff to 3 Israeli ambassadors to the United States, and was a Consul General of Israel to the Pacific Southwest region, had his family here at Sinai Akiba Academy, was always a phone call away during difficult times in the land of Israel and also during joyous times, and it's just a pleasure to have you back home. Please send our regards to Myra and to your entire family. Ambassador David Siegel. We also have this evening the Right Honorable Joan Ryan, a member of the Parliament of the UK for 17 years, served in many senior roles, including in Prime Minister Tony Blair's government. She serves as the UK's Special Representative to Cyprus and was appointed to the Privy Council by Her Majesty the Queen. Ryan famously resigned from the Labour Party in 2019 to protest its culture of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. She is now Executive Director of Elnet's UK office, which opened in London in 2021. And last but not least, this bio I don't have, but I'm supposed to know it, Max Webb Emeritus Rabbi of Sinai Temple, Rabbi David Wolpe, who retired just 2 years ago. Last year served as a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School. And I can tell you what I do and Rabbi Guzik do in the work of Israel and US and European relations. We have an amazing, amazing model to follow over 2 decades of service to Sinai Temple, to the Jewish people, and to the land of Israel. Rabbi Wolpe will be moderating this evening's discussion. We are excited to welcome our honored guests to our stage for this beautiful panel of Israel-European relations in Los Angeles.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I want to just make a few short acknowledgments. First of all, to thank Sinai. This really was our home, my family's home, for 5 years. I promise not to point out my daughter, but she's here in the back. And when we came from Israel in 2011, I remember that you had your play on this stage, and that was just the very beginning of a long and beautiful journey in this community that we had. So it's a great privilege to be here and to represent not the State of Israel tonight in my former capacity, but Elnet, the European Leadership Network tonight, and a little bit about what we do, why we do it, why many of you support us, and the value of that we'll talk about in a moment. I do want to point out Larry and Sue Hochberg. Larry, the co-founder of this organization, this network. 15 years ago, Larry and his colleagues came to the conclusion that something needs to be done, not just in America, but in other parts of the world, and that we can't put all our eggs in one basket. And I think looking at world politics and the reality around us, Israel needs many friends. America is the great friend and the great ally, but there are many, many other countries that form a patchwork of the security that Israel has, both economically, militarily, politically, and that's very, very important. So Larry, thank you for your leadership. We did mention, and I didn't mention yet, that Tom Flesch is not with us here tonight. We hope that he will strengthen and be back with his family, hopefully even by as early as tomorrow. It was very important for him to be here tonight. So he's with us online, so more than just in spirit, and many, many friends and supporters that are here. I want to point out Sia, of course, who is our West Coast director, who is amazing. If you don't know him yet, go out to coffee with the man. He's a lot of fun. He's very knowledgeable and a real policy expert in his own right. Sari Steinberg, who's visiting from Chicago. She's our Midwest director. Someone has to be in the cold up in the mountains there, and in the middle of America. So without further ado, let me just say a word or two about where we are. And then we'll talk to our panel, refer to our panel, and hear their insights, and I'll introduce them in one moment. But let me just say the following. Thank you, Rabbi Wolpe, for the moment of silence. Today was a very painful day in Israel, and the only way to really experience it is either to be there or to be connected with it intimately. That means watching it on television or watching it on social media, really being in touch with how deep the pain is. Any parent that has children, seeing the Bibas boys come back in black coffins is a moment that is just, it's not going to be forgotten. And I'm very happy that we had that moment of silence tonight. Their mother, Shiri Bibas, who was also, unfortunately, did not survive her brutal captivity, was not in those coffins. It was someone else. So Hamas violated the agreement, is manipulating the families. The pain and the suffering is just indescribable. And every Israeli, and I think every Jew around the world, and every decent person can feel that this can happen to anyone, to any child, to any family. And this is not making things any easier, unfortunately, but it's part of our reality. And then an 82, now should have been 84, Lifshitz, who was one of the founders of the peace movement in Israel and lived in Nero's and took Palestinian kids to Save a Child's Heart and other programs for healthcare in Israel, was also brutally murdered. And these two boys they did not die in an Israeli bombing. They were butchered. They were butchered. We know this now. We know it was only a few weeks after the kidnapping in November 2023, and a lot more will come out about this, but it's a very, very painful day, and it's been a painful year, as Rabbi, you said so eloquently. But it's also been a year where Israel, in a very difficult process, overcame many of the challenges that it had. It still has many before it. It's a moment where the situation in Gaza is fraught with dangers and difficulty. We're still waiting for 6 hostages alive to come home this weekend. One of them is from our small community in Tzur Adasa. So we're all one very small family here. And more dead that will come in. And then the question is about phase 2 and what do you do with Gaza? And everyone is, many in the world are condemning the President of the United States for what was said. It's also true that the previous administration tried to remove approximately 1 million Palestinians, but the neighborhood didn't accept them, and this is part of the tragedy of what happened. So maybe this is a moment to shake up the region with what was said and to have the Arab countries take more ownership over the future of Gaza, but it's all very, very, very complicated and sensitive, and that's Gaza. And what we have coming at us is the problem of Iran and their race to nuclear capability, and there are deep, deep concerns about the timelines on that, and the clocks are ticking, both on their missile defense that they'll try to reconstruct and on the bomb itself. Again, time is of essence, and the role that Europe plays, that you'll hear tonight, both with what we call snapback sanctions and part of this coalition, is going to be very, very significant moving forward. May not appear like that right now, given the debates in the transatlantic conversation now over Ukraine and Russia, but we're looking at the Middle East right now, and the Europeans are going to be very important partners here. Despite the challenges, and let me just add that, what else is coming at us is the problem of Turkey, which, many observers and many experts say Turkey will be the next Iran-like problem in the Middle East, and they will be threatening not just Israel, but through Syria also the Kingdom of Jordan, and there are very, very high stakes here and moving pieces that are moving very, very quickly. So all of this leads to the conclusion that Israel cannot be alone in this complex reality and cannot only rely on the United States, but has to rely on many, many countries. I don't know if you know, but Israel's largest trade partners are not here in America. They're in Europe. Israel's export markets, much of Israel's imports, critical imports, come from Europe. You'll hear from Joan in a few minutes about the significance of the UK-Israel relationship and on many, many areas that we'll discuss. So don't take it from me. You'll hear it from a European leader in a moment, and we'll start with you, Joan. But just to set the table clear that Elnet, like AIPAC, like other organizations here in the United States, Elnet is the preeminent pro-Israel network in Europe. Europe, the largest markets. Europe, the democratic allies of the State of Israel. Not always easy to navigate, but many, many, many friends of Israel are there, and they need to be engaged and educated and sometimes mobilized. And we can't do it from Israel or from the United States. It's the Europeans that do it through the offices that we run. We have 6 offices in Europe, full-time offices with professional staff. Joan, you heard, is a former member of parliament, former minister in the British government, and many, many other things. We're very fortunate that she joined us. That's one of the 6 offices that we have. We have an office in Paris that does very important work in a very difficult environment. We have an office in Germany that was very much part of the Arrow 3 purchase by Germany from the State of Israel, the largest defense export in Israel's history, over $4 billion that came back into Israel's defense industries before October 7th, or throughout this period. It's a multi-year process, but critical for Israel's defense industries. Germany is part of something called Sky Shield, which is over 20 European countries, all in need of missile defense. So the Arrow 3 is not the end, it's just the beginning of much, much larger relationships of the future. And we're talking about AI and technology and defense and cyber and counterterrorism It's an enormous relationship. Most Americans are not focused on it. Tonight is the moment to focus on the fact that while today was devastating, the period since October 7th was devastating. I think Rabbi Wolpe was the one who said on the Dan Senor podcast, we're very good at identifying our enemies. We're not always so good at cultivating our friends. And we do have many friends, and they need to be cultivated. And this is what Elnet is all about. So without further ado, Joan Ryan, our director in the UK. Joan, tell us about the situation in the UK, or the importance of the UK to the state of Israel and also to the Jewish community. How do you see the relationship?
Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. Can I just say it's a delight to be here with you and to say I'm a long-standing friend of Israel, and I'm always very proud to say that I'm a Zionist, and I feel I'm amongst friends tonight, so thank you. I think in terms of the relationship between the UK and Israel, we should start from the point of view of our values that we all share, and that Israel and the UK share. It's a very long-standing friendship. It goes back, in fact, before the Balfour Declaration, and many UK Prime Ministers have supported the relationship with Israel, and we want that to continue. We share our values, our democracy, the way in which we think we should be living, the kind of communities we want to build. I'm not Jewish. This isn't about being Jewish. This is about the kind of world that we want to live in, that we want to build for our children and for our grandchildren. So that's my starting point, and that we do that together. The chief rabbi once said to me, Joan, anti-Semitism isn't just a problem for Jews. And he's right, because what anti-Semitism does is it rots democracy, it rots the body politic, it rots our communities, and it destroys society. And we all of us, have a vested interest in standing up to that kind of hatred. In terms of the relationship, it's a crucial relationship. UK and Israel, UK, Europe, EU and Israel are strategic allies. And yes, everybody needs their friends. Friends are a great bonus. But more than anything else, what Israel needs is strong, solid, reliable allies. And that's what we want the UK to be. Now, I know there are times when there are questions about that. There's pros and cons, and we can talk about them. But at the moment, whenever the missiles have come over from Iran, the UK has been there, France has been there, with the US. When you need your allies is when things are hard. It's easy to be there when things are going well. That's easy to be friends, to be allies then. The measure of it is when times are difficult. If you look at the relationship, in terms of defence, we have huge cooperation, and for many, many years. In terms of counter-terrorism and policing, many exchanges, many operations where they work together. Terrorism on our streets, much of it fueled by Iran. MI5, our kind of secret service, has given evidence at the select committees that the number of terrorist activities and plots that they're facing every year on the streets of London and across the UK and across the rest of Europe, that there's about 22 plots each year that they are countering with the help of Mossad and Israel working together with our police and our counter-terrorism. That's keeping British citizens safe. If you look at our health services, 1 in 5 of every prescription that is given to a person who needs health care, 1 in 5 comes from Teva. the Israeli company. And that's phenomenal. What would happen to our health service if that relationship collapsed? It would be incredibly serious. Agri-tech, we work together, and we know, I mean, Israel is a modern-day miracle, and it's a miracle we need to share in. There's all kinds of areas we work together. There's about 32,000 jobs in Israel depend on the trade between Israel and the UK, and there's 38,000 jobs in the UK that depend on that trade. This is a two-way street. It's not one country gains, little Israel gains from what is not, quite so big, UK. If you look at the map, it's bigger than Israel, but it's not huge. That relationship benefits both. It's a two-way street, and we have to support it. And we have to work hard to ensure that all our politicians know that that relationship really matters. And we're going to stand together because we are stronger together. And the US alone is not going to be enough. Europe has a natural affinity with Israel, and we need to develop that and to grow it and to value it and cherish it.
Thank you, Joan. You have index cards. Thank you. You have index cards on your tables, so we're going to go to Q&A from the audience in a little while, so please start thinking of the questions that you want to ask our panel and write down those questions, and Sia and the team here will collect the index cards from you. Okay. And now we're going to move on to someone that I hope everyone here knows. I certainly do, Rabbi Wolpe. Rabbi Wolpe, you know, when you retired, I think you were expecting a quiet time of study and contemplation and maybe writing a book and maybe even teaching a little bit at a place called Harvard. And things sort of developed in surprising ways for you post-October 7th. And of course, you were selected to be on the task force to fight anti-Semitism at Harvard. You then famously resigned to make a point that was very important. I think we should all acknowledge, and I certainly do, the courage in taking a stand publicly like that. You know, it's been said that courage is not something that you can teach. Courage is something that you have within you, and that relates to both our panelists. So, Rabbi, if you can share with us, maybe we all know about that experience. We also know about the state of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. How do you process that? Where do you see the conversation going? What should the response be from your experience at Harvard over the last year? Thank you.
Relating it to Europe, which is what I want to do because I want to make a touch on the Elnet experience, I would say that Harvard was half of Europe, by which I mean half of what we have to worry about in Europe was represented at Harvard. Not all of it, but half of it. And the half that we have to worry about that was represented at Harvard was a combination of a very hard left ideology, which is even more prevalent in Europe than it is in America, and Islamism, which is, again, even more prevalent in Europe than it is in America. Both of those exist on college campuses, especially, by the way, ironically, elite college campuses. They had fewer problems in campuses in the South and the Midwest than they did in California and on the East Coast. And part of it was that very clever and resource-rich Arab nations were funneling a lot of money into elite campuses. And when I asked, for example, I won't go into the whole story, but I remember saying to Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard, but what about all this money that you take from Qatar? And her answer was, we don't take any money from Qatar. We only take money from families. And I said, Claudine, the ruling family of Qatar is not a family. They're actually what rules Qatar. So when, and of course she knew this, but when you're receiving that much money, and by the way, college presidents are judged primarily by the amount of money that they can bring in, and nobody says, well, show me the sources of the money you've just brought in. When you can bring in that kind of money, it has a profound effect, and that co-joining of radical Islam and radical progressivism, you saw the results, and you see the results still, even though they've been somewhat tempered across college campuses. You also see them, of course, in Europe, but please don't make the mistake of being too definitive. Like I don't know how many people I've heard say, France is over, Britain is over, and that is just a foolish thing to say. First of all, because we can't afford for major European countries to be over, and to consign them to the dustbin of history without a fight, a big fight, a constant fight, is just foolish. And second, because every country is very complicated. You know how complicated the United States is. Very complicated. France and Britain are no less complicated than the United States. And by the way, Eastern European countries have their own complications, which is the second half of the danger I want to speak about. Right now, most American Jews are focused on the dangers of the left, for good reason. But we are too wise to think that there are not dangers on the right. And in Europe, in Germany, in Hungary, in Turkey, in other places, there are significant dangers coming from the right. And one of the things that Elnet distinguishes itself in, and Jews should in general, but too few do, is we don't actually care where the harm from the Jews comes from. We want to fight it on all sides. And this is, by the way, true in some ways in the United States too. You always have to pay attention to all sides, because there isn't a political side of the aisle that has always and will always love Jews, and a political side of the aisle that has always and will always hate them. Both are capable of doing tremendous damage here and in Europe, and you need an organization whose primary loyalty is not to a side of the aisle, but is to Jewish interests. That's what, for example, for years, AIPAC would, and still, would find right, left, center, it didn't matter. Their only concern was, what's your attitude towards Israel? And in Europe, too, we have to care about, I did a conference in Hungary a year and a half ago, and I was with several other religious leaders, and there was some talk there about Christian nationalism that would make everybody in this room extremely uncomfortable. And I remember saying, it's really good that you invited a rabbi to this conference, because I happen to remember the last time Christian nationalism was prominent in Hungary, and it did not turn out well for my people. So one of the things that we have to do is to give some of our time and resources to nonpartisan battles for Israel and against anti-Semitism. That's our responsibility. We can't allow ourselves to be sucked into the binaries that the rest of the country seems so delighted in occupying on this side or that side. It has never been good when there is any kind of unilateral, unchallenged rule where speech is shut down, where people can do whatever they want, when rulers are arbitrary. So we have to keep an eye on that all across the globe, because that always spells danger for Jews.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on that. You're so right, Rabbi Wolpe, about not writing off a country. Because although when Jeremy Corbyn had allowed the Labour Party to become engulfed with anti-Semitism, poisonous, and came within six seats of being able to make a coalition and walk into 10 Downing Street in 2017, in 2019, although the few of us who'd left the Labour Party to draw back the curtain and show the public the toxic nature of those politics. It was the British people who defeated Jeremy Corbyn and handed to him the worst result the Labour Party had had since 1935, and showed him there is a price to pay for anti-Semitism. And I just think that should give us a great deal of hope, despite everything we've seen on our streets in the past year and a half. The majority of people are not marching the streets, and the majority of people are decent when given some leadership and can see what's going on.
Thank you. So, Joan, maybe this is an opportunity for you to share a little bit of what you did in that critical year when you stood up and stood up for your values and the values that you believed needed to be defended. You sacrificed a 41-year political career to oppose Corbyn publicly at tremendous personal cost. So share with us a little bit of that experience and how you see the terrain in the UK and Europe today when it comes to Jewish issues and anti-Semitism.
Well, it was something of a shock when Jeremy Corbyn actually became leader of the Labour Party. It wouldn't be something anybody would have expected, but certain rule changes led to a lack of care and understanding of consequences led to this rule change that allowed this to happen. And sometimes we forget how fragile democracy is and we don't look after it properly within political parties and generally across the board. I was chair of Labour Friends of Israel at the time, and I think they're a great organisation. And I also think Conservative Friends of Israel are as well. We've had some really good support of these organisations. But I've always thought we needed a cross-party organisation because we're not embedded in one of the parties and we can speak truth to power when we think they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And we're not constrained by needing to be publicly loyal to that party. We're always respectful. We never make it personal, but we are able to call out when it's wrong, when there's policies and actions that are harmful to Israel or to the Jewish community. In terms of what happened under Jeremy Corbyn, from 2015, he became more and more bold and more things were happening. It was a slow burn at first, but speeded up considerably. And there was incidents such as at the Oxford University Labour Club, where young members of that club who were students, 20-year-olds, 19, 18-year-olds, were told to get out, that they were called Zios as a term of abuse, and they were told they weren't part of the community of the good. And these kind of things were happening. And when I asked Jeremy Corbyn what he was going to do about it, he said, and this was in a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, he said, "Why are you asking me? This is the leader of the party. Why am I asking him?" I did wonder why at that point. We had years of this until he was refusing to meet with us. Till we were getting nowhere with him and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And then he came close in the 2017 election. Up to that point, everybody had been dismissing it as just, he's an electoral liability. It was never about that. It's a moral duty, and it's morally repugnant to allow the party to abandon all its traditional and decent values and become consumed with anti-Semitism as a culture within the party. Of course, once that happened, sadly, some people decided to keep their heads down. And I think one of the lessons we have to learn is there's no neutral ground with anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. People are often saying be a critical friend, and what they mean by that is more criticism and less friendship. If you are a member of Parliament, a member of Congress, you are a leader. You don't have to be Prime Minister, you're a leader in your borough, your constituency, your county. If you're a mayor, if you're any kind of elected representative, you have a leadership role. And we need to demand so much more of our politicians. They need to have much more courage about speaking up on these matters, because that's part of why we elect them. And that wasn't happening in the Labour Party. So, there was a lot of abuse. I'm sure people have read about all the abuse. But I didn't want to kind of really go into all of that, because it wasn't about me, and I didn't want to make it about me. I wanted people to focus on what was happening in our society and in our politics, and the dangers that posed if Jeremy Corbyn ever got elected Prime Minister. So, in the end, a small group of us did resign from the party. I wanted to be sure that I could speak out. If I'd spoken out and said some of the things I really wanted to say, although I'd said plenty, but there's a kind of line that you couldn't step over without being expelled. If I was expelled, then anything I said after that would be categorised as sour grapes. So I decided I would resign, and I'd cite the anti-Semitism, and then I would use that platform to call him out and all the kind of things they were doing. And I knew the price of that. I didn't go into it blind. I knew what I was doing. I knew it meant I wouldn't stand again. But I'd served 17 years. I think people had had enough of me, really. So it was highly unlikely I'd be front bench again. I felt at that point it was highly unlikely that Labour would ever win another election. It wasn't such a great sacrifice, seriously, because for me, we'd crossed so many red lines that I just felt I was really letting people down. I was letting down my own values and everything I believed in, and the kind of world I wanted for my kids. And that I just had to, that moment came. And I think it comes for a lot of people in different ways, maybe not about this issue at all. But people need to stand up and be counted. And we've learned so many lessons, but we're still not using them all. We've learned how important leadership is. We've learned that you've got to stand up to anti-Semitism the minute it happens. The first instance, it's got to be called out. We've learned that people have got to accept that anti-Zionism is just the recent iteration of a centuries-old hatred called anti-Semitism, and that's what it is. We've learned that we've got to stand up to these calls for decolonisation of our education system and decolonisation of the curriculum. The greatest movement of decolonisation in the 20th century is Zionism. And that needs to be understood. And Israel's right and the Jewish people's right in their homeland to self-determination is what Zionism is. It's not some kind of pernicious. And the other thing we've learned since October the 7th, we thought once Keir Starmer came along, and he's not perfect, but he's not Jeremy Corbyn, and I think he does have integrity about wanting to root out anti-Semitism from the Labour Party, and he's taken actions where he's driven out a lot of that hard left. But what has happened after October the 7th is we see that anti-Semitism that engulfed the Labour Party has seeped in to the rest of our society because it became normalised. And that's the danger of this. It goes a little bit underground, but it's there. And it's still there, and it's pernicious. And we have to stand up to it, and on campus for sure.
I'm so glad that that was the closing point that you made, because it's exactly where I wanted to pick up. I want to offer you an anthropological theory to start this, which is most people do not have really deep-seated beliefs about most things, but they can be very easily manipulated into thinking they have deep-seated beliefs. Believe me, before October 7th, most of the kids in that encampment had no theory about Israel one way or the other, but as soon as a small, devout core told them that this is what to believe, the seeds were already there for that to be ignited, and then they became fanatically anti-Israel. And the reason that that's important is what seeds you cultivate in a society and what voices you elevate have a great deal to do with the direction that that society is going to go. It is not at all preset that most people in most countries will feel this way or that way about an issue that isn't directly affecting their dinner table. And so when it comes to something like anti-Semitism, there are many, I don't have to tell you the seeds of anti-Semitism in Europe, right? They're all, I mean, the ground is seeded with the seeds of anti-Semitism in Europe. So if the voices of anti-Semitism are elevated and given priority and both feted and fed, you will get anti-Semitism that will be extremely difficult then to root out. But there are a lot of counter voices. The question is, as happened, say, with Corbyn and Starmer, are you able to feed them sufficiently in time? And every day that's lost is a day that's lost. And it really does matter how quickly and how effectively we not only suppress the voices that are hateful, but we elevate the voices that are idealistic. Because all through Europe, there are people whose minds aren't really made up. And they can be moved in one direction or another. When I was in London not that long after October 7th, and I was in the march, I saw the march the day before, the Palestinian march, which was on Shabbos, so that's why I didn't participate. And that was a joke, and thank you. And then I went the next day of the march, and a lot of non-Jews were in that march. A lot of non-Jews. And the reason they were there is because we were marching. So if you elevate those voices and you help organizations that elevate those voices, don't think that this is a quixotic adventure. It actually makes a substantial difference to the fate of a lot of people's ideological systems, because unlike the people in this room, they don't all know how they feel until they hear it from the people around them. And once their community moves in a certain direction, they will too.
I think that's a very powerful insight, Rabbi. You know, part of the Israel experience, when you're watching television, when people are really guiding you through what you're supposed to be feeling. And I think that's a very important insight, and part of a major part of what Elnet does is when you bring a delegation to Israel and you bring them to the south after October 7th, and we've done over 30 of these delegations with over 400 members of parliament from 27 countries in Europe. This is what this small organization has done, more than any other organization in the world, at least that I know of. And you see the impact that it has on these officials, legislators, heads of think tanks, journalists. And we can tell you stories that are just unbelievable. We had French people come to Israel and demand to go to the south on October 7th. By October 8th, they were already down there with film crews, and they were documenting. And they had to convince the IDF to let us go. And our teams were under fire. I mean, we had drivers that their black vans were basically shot up because they weren't in those vans. They were with us, with the IDF, going through the kibbutzim. The effect on these legislators is a lifelong effect. They completely changed the way they look at Israel and they look at the issues that we're all involved in. They wouldn't have that experience if they didn't come to Israel with us. And, we can share one example with you. We brought the first military delegation to Israel of former military officials, some current, mostly former. And the idea was to help cultivate a whole generation of speakers on behalf of Israel that would go back to their own societies, speak in their own language, speak with their own local perspective about what they saw in Israel. And we took them, believe it or not, into Gaza with the IDF. It was the only delegation that we know of that was around 30 people from 7 countries, NATO countries, including the United States, that went into Gaza with Elnet to the Philadelphia corridor, to the Rafah crossing, toured the tunnels underground, saw what was happening under the Egyptian border, and they were embedded with the IDF for 4 hours in Gaza. This has never been done before by anyone, any organization, anything. The IDF has never done this. We're about to do it again next week. And one of the people that we brought, thank you, one of the people that we brought.
And David, you forgot to say that it was Elnet UK that initiated that.
Absolutely. And actually, this was part of the creative work that Joan led, is if you can't reach people directly, you're going to reach them indirectly. And by bringing military people from the UK to Israel, the idea was to start breaking through those barriers and have these people speak for us. One of them was General McCall, who was the deputy commander of NATO and the high command in the UK.
He was the Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe.
And he came to Israel very skeptical. He was not a natural, not an enemy, but he wasn't necessarily a friend. And he went through this whole experience with Joan and with Elnet, and ended up basically saying that what I read was not true, and that the IDF is more professional than the NATO forces were in much more complex circumstances in Gaza. And he went on public television in the UK over and over again to spread that message and wrote op-eds. This is the way you cultivate leadership to fight with you, side by side with you. So like Rabbi Wolpe said, if you just leave and drop your marbles and leave the table, you're not going to have the kind of results that we see every day. And it's a privilege to be part of this effort. So before we go to your questions, my last question would be the following to both of you, and that is, what gives you hope? What gives you hope both here in the United States, Rabbi Wolpe, and Joan, what gives you hope in Europe and the UK?
So I'll give you I have a standard answer for this that I've now used several times, and then I will, the standard answer I have is that way back last December, I was at a BBYO convention with 4,000 Jewish teens. And I was on a panel with 3 other people. And the last question was, what gives you hope? And so I was going to say 4,000 Jewish teens at the BBYO convention. Unfortunately, I was the 4th person on the panel. So the first 3 all said 4,000 Jewish teens, and I didn't get to say it. And I thought, you better think of something else quickly. And I had this sort of flash. I said, what gives me hope is I'm talking to my great-great-great-grandfather. And I say to him, there's anti-Semitism at Harvard. And he says to me, there are Jews at Harvard? And I say, yeah, but they hate Israel. And he goes, and there's an Israel? And I realize that as terrible as our problems are, part of what gives me hope is, I remember at our 100th anniversary, we had Elie Wiesel, and I'm walking him back to the hotel, and I was talking about this problem that American Jewry has and that problem that American Jewry has, and he said to me, David, when we got out of the camps, we had 3 impossible problems to solve. One was to build a state of Israel, the other was to free Soviet Jewry, and the third was to revitalize Jewish life. He said, we did the first 2. You have no right to despair of doing the third. And I thought, wow, you can't, our perspective, thank God, is skewed, because we are still the luckiest generation of Jews that has ever walked the face of the earth. We're devastated because terrible things have happened in Israel, but of course that presupposes that there is an Israel for terrible things to happen, which hasn't been true for thousands of years. It's still backed by the strongest country and the greatest country in the history of the world, which is the one that we are all citizens of. And so there is a great deal that gives me hope. I still think that America, for all of our different kinds of struggles and so on, is both a great and a good nation. And I really believe there is in this country a deep, deep well of sympathy for Israel and what it represents, and that America understands what we all know, which is that Israel is not fighting for Israel. That Israel really is fighting for the battle of Western civilization, and that Europe and the United States and other places like the 51st state of Canada, all those places, their survival ultimately is based on this, on Israel being able and its allies being able to prevail in what is essentially a civilizational war. And so I really, I am hopeful, and besides all of that, I have faith.
Well, I'm a progressive, and I don't think you could be one of those if you weren't hopeful. I have faith in people. And I know it's people who do bad things, but it's also people who do good things. When I say about the British public defeating an anti-Semite and preventing him becoming our Prime Minister, that gives me hope. I have faith that if we do the work that we're doing, if everybody does what they can do, every little thing you do, every letter you write, every time you get in touch with your member of Congress or a senator or a local mayor or any representative, every time you get in touch with them about these issues, every time you contact a radio station or a TV station, every time you give another person some support when they're feeling like they're losing their hope, all these things bring people together to fight the things that are wrong, that are evil. And I know that we can win through that, because if you look all around the world, the amount that people are willing to sacrifice their own lives to fight for their right to live in a democracy, I think that tells you just how much people want this. They want what we are offering. They want what we are fighting for. We have purpose and we have mission, and it really matters to people. And the other thing that gives me hope is meeting young people on the Iron Domes in Israel. Unbelievable. They are 18 and 19, young women and young men. And people often say young people would not make these sacrifices for their country anymore. Well, look at the young people of Israel. They're fighting for their future. They're fighting for their parents and their grandparents. They're fighting for their future children and their brothers and sisters. And they're fighting for freedom and decency and the values that we all hold dear. And if that matters to them to the degree that at that age they're there and they put their life on the line and they protect other people's lives, then that gives me a huge amount of hope.
Rabbi.
I just want to, since it happened today, I just want a coda to this is, you know, I have a friend who says if you don't have WhatsApp, you're not a Zionist. Because that's how you communicate with everybody in Israel, is by WhatsApp. And I literally today, by WhatsApp, received a message from the parents of a hostage who was killed, saying how grateful they are for the support of the American Jewish community and our friends. And of course, the first thing I think is I feel terrible because we do nothing compared to what they do, as Joan just said. But the other thing that gives me hope is that there is this bond that really, I mean, Israel has seen what American Jews how American Jews are tied to Israel in a deep, deep way. And I think a lot of American Jews who didn't know they were tied to Israel have all of a sudden discovered how tight that bond is. And that's a very powerful thing.
Well, I'll just add my 2 cents. What gives me hope is leaders like Joan, who teaches us every day that we have friends out there, and we're in the business of cultivating these friends, and I see it every day, and I'm used to seeing non-Jewish leaders that are standing up for Israel in over 20, 25 countries around the world, so especially in Europe. So that gives me hope. And the second thing that gives me hope is the leadership that we're hearing from Rabbi Wolpe, and our community needs bold, courageous leadership, people who will stand up and help educate the larger society about what is at stake. Now, we have many, many questions here, so I'm going to ask all of us to keep it brief so that we can get to, and I'm going to group some of them together, so please forgive me if I'm not actually reading your exact question. We have 3 cards here, so that must mean that it is a resonating issue. Concerns about the demographic future of the UK given Islamic immigration. So Joan, is there a future to the Jewish community in the UK, in Europe, in your eyes? How do you see the longer term demographic threats, political challenges in the years ahead?
Well, I think immigration is it's a problem right across Europe. It's a problem here in America. It's an issue that people are concerned about. When I was in government, I was a Home Office minister, which means I dealt with immigration and refugees. And what I always discovered amongst people was it's not so much that they're against immigration. They want to know that it's fair. And they want to know that they're not being taken for a ride. And we also know that there are politicians who will use immigration as a means of deflecting blame for failure from themselves. And that's irresponsible. But you should have a fair but firm immigration policy, that it is not wrong for people to want that. But we should also recognise that, immigration has brought great riches to our countries and brought great economic reward on occasion. And it's a good thing to give asylum to those who need it. That's a positive. However, we have a responsibility around the world. And if we accept that responsibility, we might be able to do something about immigration. You can't blame people for wanting to come and live in the kind of societies we live in, because they're great. That's why we want to stay in them. That's why we want to protect them. That's why we live in them. But one thing that's happened in the UK, and I don't think, it is a criticism of many past governments, of all political complexions, we have been really poor at integration. And I don't mean assimilation, I mean integration. If you want to come and live in the UK, you don't have to assimilate, you don't have to forget where you come from or who you are or what your heritage is. I'm very proud to be British, but I'm also very proud of my Irish heritage. My parents are both Irish, and I'm proud of them, and I'm proud of that heritage. But I don't go to the UK, I don't live in the UK and try and change it and turn it into Ireland. And I think integration is really important, and I think we've been very, very poor at it. And I understand why people get upset if communities come and settle in the UK and then start to want to change the law and the culture and what happens in our schools to fit in with something they've been fleeing from. I don't think we should be letting that happen. And I think the way to counter it is through education and through integration. And we don't give that enough focus. And now, besides the terrible anti-Semitism, we've got a big increase in Islamophobia. which is shocking. This is so divisive that we have to stand up to this, and we have to reassert the really solid, good values of our democracy, and then we have to protect them.
So I want to just summarize, I think, in a sentence, the points that we essentially are agreeing on, which is the problem is not that somebody wants to come and not live the way we want them to. The problem is the civilizational self-confidence of the countries themselves to say, if you're going to come here, this is the way you have to live. And if you're not going to live according to this place, then this isn't the place for you. So I think that it doesn't make sense. I mean, that is elementary. And so I really, again, the more you elevate the Britishness of Britain, the Frenchness of France, the Italianness of Italy, the sounder our world will be, because those are the foundations on which those societies were constructed.
So we have a follow-up question on the issue of Muslim immigration. How do we nurture those relationships in the UK and in Europe in general, in your eyes? So what more can be done to help bridge the gaps between the two communities?
There's clearly a need for greater knowledge. At one point, some 15, 20 years ago, the government ministers and that were working with a Muslim council, and they didn't realise that it was Muslim Brotherhood. So knowledge is power. It needs to be understood. So first of all, I think many politicians and people in all kinds of jobs, not least education and local authorities, and they need to educate themselves. I think we need to understand the difference between political Islam, terrorism that's related to Islamism, and decent, ordinary Muslims. And we need to make sure they know that we know that. And we need to work closely to ensure that the leaders in those communities work with the values of the society and educate within their own communities and strengthen them in standing up to Islamism, which is it's damaging both to the Muslim community and to the wider community. In terms of anti-Semitism, I think it's long-term, it's about education. And I think some of the proposals and the things that Keir Starmer has actually suggested of late have got a great deal of value. So I said earlier about this, decolonise the curriculum and decolonise education. What Keir Starmer is suggesting is that Holocaust education will become a compulsory part of the school curriculum, and not just as a one-off, but threaded throughout that curriculum, throughout those school years. And I think that's really important. A survey in the last couple of days shows that 1 in 3 young people in the UK believe that Israel treats the Palestinians the way the Nazis treated the Jews. Now, that is not something we want our young people to believe. It's obviously really offensive to the Jewish communities and to Israel, but it's really damaging to those young people as well. What kind of community will we have if we don't tackle these issues? So I was a teacher for many years. I know how important education is, and parents know it too. And I think if we want long-term change and understanding, then that's where it needs to be.
Well, thank you, Joan. And we have at least 3 cards here relating to the same questions about how to educate people, how to fight anti-Israel media outlets. Are there conservative outlets in Europe that can balance this? I just want to add from our experience in Elnet, we have brought Muslim delegations to Israel from Europe. There are moderate leaders that are fighting the Muslim Brotherhood. They're very close to the Gulf. And remember, just like the Middle East is divided into 3 camps, the quote-unquote moderate Sunni countries, or the countries that are involved in peace agreements with Israel from the Gulf to Israel's neighbor, they have a reflection in Europe as well, because they're fighting Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and the communities in Europe have the same division between moderates who want a stake in a shared future versus the radicals in their own communities. So the more we empower moderation inside Islam by bringing them to Israel, by taking them to shared cities, by going to Akko, going to Haifa, going to hospitals where you see Jews and Muslim Israelis working side by side, the better we're all going to be. And this is a huge topic, and we're going to run out of time, so I do want to leave that. We talked about education. Let me just say that Holocaust education is very important. It's a beginning, it's not an end. We need to also educate about the current state of the Jewish civilization, Jewish contributions to society today. Another reason that I am hopeful is because the relationship with Israel is reciprocal. Israel's doing a lot for the world, Israel is doing a lot for this country, and Israel's doing a lot for European countries. The counterterrorism, the high-tech exchanges, the cooperation on AI that we're going to have to do so much more on just to stay and compete. Europe, the United States, and Israel is going to be enormous in the future. The missile defense, the cybersecurity, the healthcare that we talked about. 1 in 5 prescription pills in the UK is produced by Israel. So it's a reciprocal relationship, and we need to keep educating about the value of this partnership over time. We have a question about the Trump administration. And are the new policies going to turn Europe against Israel? So the provocations or the policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia, the policies vis-a-vis Gaza and the Middle East. Let me maybe start by saying it's very early in this process. I heard an Israeli former intelligence official basically say that what Trump is doing is like the opening move in a game of pool. It's called the break. So you hit the ball hits all the other balls, the status quo is broken, and then it's up to the parties to try to figure out what to do next. So what's happening in Gaza is way more complicated than that. The fact is that Hamas was not defeated. It was defeated militarily, but as we all know, unfortunately, it's still very much there. We're going to need to have an international framework that deals with the day after in Gaza, and we're already there, and it's highly political and highly sensitive, and we don't have the time to go into it tonight. But the whole Middle East now is dealing with this. It's not just Israel's issue anymore. The Arab countries are trying to put together a counter-proposal and what to do with this. It's very clear that you can't leave a population like that in the ruins the way they are, controlled by a terror organization. Something is going to have to change, and we hope and pray that Israeli hostages will be taken out, that the war will come to some sort of conclusion, that Hamas will not be part of the day after. There's a lot to do on that. But let me.
I know my congregation always wants to hear me talk about Trump, so I'm sure you're very excited to hear what I will have to say. I'm going to say this very quickly, and then we'll let the person who actually knows something about it say this. What strikes me about the phenomenon of what's going on in America right now, and this is not 100%, but on social media, it's 90-some%, is either people think everything the man does is perfect and can never go wrong, or they think nothing the man does will ever work out and everything he does is terrible. And the only thing I know is that no one knows. We are really bad at predicting the future. They did a meta-study of politicians on Sunday morning talk shows who tell you what's going to happen next week. They were worse than random chance. And these are people who are supposed to be experts. So anybody who says this is what's going to happen because of Trump's policy in the Middle East, or this is what's going to happen because of Trump's policy in Europe, I guarantee you can take this from the rabbi, they do not know, and neither do we. And as David said, we can all make our guesses, but we live in a fluid and extremely complicated world. And remember that if you make a guess, you're guessing one out of an infinite number of possibilities. And what are the odds that you will be right? So the answer, David, is we don't have an answer.
Correct. Joan, do you want to say a word about Europe, Trump, and the Middle East?
Well, I don't have a prediction, but I think that, you know, the Middle East and, of course, in Europe, Ukraine, I think there's a bit of a sense of shock at the moment, really, particularly around some of the things President Trump has said about Ukraine. We don't know. It does feel a little bit reckless, the way he approaches things. And I can't say that I think it's right that he should do a deal with Putin and try and leave out President Zelensky or Europe. I think our strength is in the fact that we're strategic allies and we should operate as such. I do think leaders have not been bold enough and strong enough, and certainly not in the face of Vladimir Putin. I think President Trump needs to be very careful because just telling Vladimir Putin, you know, okay, now this is the deal, I wouldn't want to guarantee he's going to stick to that. And I do think maybe President Trump is about making a deal and less conscious or aware of the strength of ideology, and that certainly would apply in the Middle East. I don't think it's a bad thing to shake things up. I just think we don't know what the outcome will be. And sometimes you do need to tread carefully. And there are things that he's done and said that I'm not sorry he's done them and said them. And sometimes he says things and you think it's kind of common sense and somebody needed to say that. But I think you can't afford to be reckless with your allies because you need them. And if we, you know, we should have learnt that through certainly 2 world wars, for instance, and a nuclear threat. I think you can't just do a deal with Iran, and you can't just do a deal with Putin. These are malign actors. I don't know that you can trust them, but I hope something good comes from it. I did say to David this morning, when you do the, you know, breaking the pool triangle, sometimes you can get it wrong and the white ball follows all the rest down the holes. So just got to be really careful.
It's an analogy that we're going to be thinking about a lot.
It's becoming excruciating now, isn't it?
We do have, and what we're going to need to do, there's just too many questions here, and we don't want to keep you all evening, and they're all important questions, but there is a question about Iran. Let me just say that we are in a moment in history that is very, very significant. The existential threat to Israel remains Iran, although Iran has been weakened, thank goodness, by the fall of Syria, by taking out Iran's air defenses, by the IDF, by taking out, decimating Hezbollah with the beepers and the radios and taking out their long-range missiles and weakening Hamas and the Houthis as well. So all of this has taken place before our eyes. But Iran is, the indications are very concerning that they are racing towards some sort of nuclear weapons device. and that the time is running very short, and that the clocks, as I mentioned before, we all mentioned, are ticking, and we're going to have to reach decisions very soon. This was part of the reason why the Prime Minister came to Washington a few weeks ago, and it was discussed very significantly, and it is true that Trump would, or the administration would favor a deal with Iran after increasing the pressure on Iran. Many Israelis believe that now's the time to take out the nuclear reactors once and for all. It's very significant. It's underground. Israel doesn't necessarily have the capabilities of doing it all on its own. And here Europe plays an important role, because you should know that both the UK and France, behind the scenes, have been very robust with Israel, sometimes even more than the United States, and this goes back a decade, in fighting for harsher terms to constrain Iran, especially now when Iran joined Russia in attacking the heart of Europe and attacking Ukraine. And you've heard about that drone that hit the nuclear reactor in the Ukraine, which was an Iranian drone. It was brought to the United States now to be shown. Iran is a very big threat to Europe, and the Europeans have been not, and the question here is, why has Europe been appeasing Iran? I think the reality is that those European countries that are focused on national security issues, both in, as Rabbi said, Eastern and Central Europe, that are facing Russia on the front lines, but also the UK and France and Germany that have been working side by side with Israel on this, are very strong allies on Iran, very strong allies on Iran, and they will be part of the solution, because the pressure on Iran is going to have to be international, and the snapback sanctions, by the way, run out in October. Snapback sanctions means you don't need the UN. The Russians and the Chinese can't block you because it's part of the nuclear deal. And if the E3, those three countries in Europe, bring it up, we can sanction Iran internationally, not just through the United States, which would be even more powerful in pressuring Iran. So let's just move on and take on a few more questions. There are a lot of questions about Gaza that we're not going to get to. Yes, today was a black day, as we all know. We've mentioned that before. The ceasefire hopefully didn't end today, because Israel is still very focused on getting those live hostages out before it's too late. And 6 are coming back this weekend with God's help. And there are many, many more that still need to be taken out. Certainly those alive, but also those that are dead, to help their families with the closure that they need. And the long-term problem of Gaza, Israel will have to deal with, and it will be very difficult, and hopefully we won't have to do it alone. Questions of moving big populations, they're not going to be taken by other countries. It's not so much a problem of removing Gazans, it's more of a problem of who will agree to take them. Unfortunately, Israel's neighbors have refused to do it and probably won't do it, maybe in small symbolic numbers. That's not where the solution is going to be, and Gaza will have to be rebuilt. Hamas will have to be removed and demilitarized, just like we're doing in Lebanon as we speak. Panelists, should we keep going, because we still have...
Yeah, I would just say it's also very dangerous for a country like Jordan to take the Palestinians from Gaza, because one thing Israel does not want is for the king of Jordan to be destabilized. We don't want that. We want him to stay right where he is, because that's good for us. So it's a very tricky proposition in every direction.
Jordan is a very important strategic partner to Israel. No matter what is said on CNN by some Middle Eastern leaders say things about each other all the time. The Israelis are criticizing the Saudis are angry at the Israelis. That doesn't mean there's not going to be a deal with Saudi Arabia. That means that everybody is maneuvering before the deal. Jordan is critically important, and Jordan is under tremendous pressure. We didn't mention the fact that 4 Israeli buses almost blew up, well, 3 blew up today, and 1 was disabled. This was all supposed to take place tomorrow morning. This is coming from the West Bank. It's because Iran is pouring resources into funding terrorism on the West Bank, and Jordan is at risk because it's being targeted by both Iran and Muslim extremists driven by Turkey Coming through Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, Jordan is at risk, and Europe, again, is a partner to Israel and the United States in helping to stabilize these countries. This is a public forum. We won't go into all the details because some of them are not for public consumption, but take our word for it. The Europeans are very important partners on the ground with us on all of these issues. I think
we
we're going to
have a campaign across Elnet in Europe to have the IRGC prescribed. And I think the sooner that happens, the better. I know it's difficult because they're a state actor, and other people, other groups we've prescribed, like Hamas and Hezbollah, are not state actors. But I think it's an incredibly important message in the first instance to prescribe a state actor that is as malign as the IRGC. And secondly, right across Europe, as I've said, and in the UK, Iran and the IRGC are the greatest operators of state-sponsored terror on our streets and drug trafficking and money laundering. And it really, really needs to be dealt with. They're a threat to just ordinary citizens across European countries, particularly European capitals, as well as the nuclear threat that they pose and the threat they pose to the Middle East. And if they do get a nuclear weapon, it will start a nuclear arms race across the whole of the Middle East. The Saudis have already said that they will want to do the same, and you can understand why. And we'll just have a proliferation across the Middle East. And that's a threat then to everybody.
So we've been very involved in increasing the pressure on Iran in Europe, both through designating the IRGC, as Joan mentioned, by designating Hezbollah as a terror organization, both the political, quote-unquote, and military wings, which we've been doing throughout Europe. The French Parliament just passed a resolution to designate the IRGC. The German courts are pressuring Brussels to designate the IRGC. There's a lot of pressure in Europe to join us in doing this, and we will be very involved this year in 2025 in helping moving that and helping fight UNRWA and all the issues that we're all very, very concerned with, because they also, of course, affect the Jewish communities in Europe and their safety. We have a question about why don't Gazans help Israel or the hostages. Let me just say that Gaza has been controlled by a genocidal terror organization for 20 years, and that control has been total from the moment you're born until the moment you pass away. It's a society that is under the thumb of terrorism. It's something we probably have never seen before, a country that was controlled by a genocidal terror organization for so long. And this is one of the answers to a very painful question. Two more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up. One of them is, what is going on with Ireland, Joan?
What's going on?
Ireland.
The story of Ireland.
Ireland.
Why is Ireland such a difficult
God.
country?
I think it's to do with Ireland's history, and I think they are, as a society, misled very badly by probably all a large number of their politicians, not all their political parties, it wouldn't be true to say, but certainly Fianna Fáil, Fianna Gael, Sinn Féin, they've got the biggest votes now. And I think they've been told that the Palestinians are oppressed by Israel as a colonial power and an occupying force in the way that they feel they were oppressed as Irish Catholics for many, many years, like 700 years, by the British. And of course, Sinn Féin exploited that very much in Northern Ireland, and are now a political force in the Republic of Ireland. They're not on their own in exploiting that particular explanation. And I think, I don't know, I didn't grow up in Ireland. I'm born in the UK. My parents grew up in Ireland, and they were not anti-Semitic and were absolutely, I suppose, what characterised their approach. They weren't a member of a British party, but they believed very much in social justice and fairness. And I don't think that it's that Irish people don't, and I've got a lot of Irish relatives, and I don't think the Catholic Church challenged any of this. And they've been a really powerful influence ever since, well, probably forever, with the Catholic community, but certainly ever since the Republic of Ireland came into being, and when it was just before that, I think with it's an established church, and I think it's been very, very powerful in Ireland, and I don't think it's in any way helped matters.
I'll add, having not grown up there and therefore knowing nothing about it, but that doesn't stop any rabbi from pontificating on subjects. If you think of the Protestants as the British, as the Israelis, and the Catholics as the Palestinians, then you see this conflict. Everybody reads the conflict through the lens of their own history. Ta-Nehisi Coates goes to Israel and he sees it, the laws there, as Jim Crow laws because he reads it through the history of slavery in America. Ireland reads it through the history of Ireland. The Jews are like, you know, the malleable characters, the malleable villains of history. Whoever oppressed you, you can identify with the Jews. And the Catholic Church, Joan a little bit maybe soft-pedaled it, has a really deep history of virulent anti-Semitism. And the countries where the Catholic Church has been strong have this anti-Semitism. I mean, if you want to read, it is a difficult but a remarkable book. Just read James Carroll's Constantine's Sword. And you will see what the Catholic Church did to the Jewish people for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And you don't turn that legacy off overnight, especially when now, remember, it was Britain that allied to beat the people who were oppressing the Jews, and a lot of Ireland was allied with the Nazis mainly because the British were against them. And so it is a complicated historical reality, but it is in some ways unsurprising that, but deeply disappointing, that Ireland, which gave us Joyce, after all, whose Ulysses has a half-Jewish main character, and the mayor of Dublin years ago was Jewish, which led to Leo DeRocher's famous line, "Only in America." But it's a country that has a deep problem with Jews for a long time, and that comes through the church. And I think that that's a big part of what you're seeing right now, which is why Ireland is off the charts in anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
And just to add to that is Ireland is really an outlier in Europe. There are countries that may be hostile to Israel today, but then they have elections and then they have a change in government like Belgium or Norway is expected. Norway is a very difficult country for Israel right now, but they're going through elections and the expectation is that it's going to be a more conservative government that will be much more pro-Israel, and we see this time and time and time again. So we never give up on Europe. We always need a platform to cultivate friendships in Europe and to be prepared for the day when we're needed. And again, you don't build an organization the day you need it. You build an organization to seed the seeds and to sow the ground and to prepare for what we need in the future. And looking at the world today, from Taiwan, China, to Ukraine, Russia, to Iran in the Middle East, Israel is going to need partners and allies. And I just want to end with a little story just so that you have a point of light and why we will always be optimistic no matter what comes our way. And Rabbi Wolpe gave the historic sweep of where we are and how fortunate this generation is to have something to fight for, and a country and independence and young soldiers and Iron Dome and everything that we're going through. We have friends, and we have friends in France, we have friends in Germany, you're seeing our friends in the UK, and they're fighting for us every day. And sometimes those fights are short, like a small company that came to our office in Berlin without going into all the details and said, we think something's going on because we can't really export that technology that Israel needs, and it's a critical component of the gear that goes into the Israeli Merkava tank. And our office went to members of parliament, and the members of parliament raised it in parliament, and the government had to respond, and it eventually led to the head of state in Germany coming out publicly and saying, there is no arms boycott against Israel, and we will continue supplying Israel with the defense goods that it needs. Starts from a little conversation in our big network, and it results in huge events. That's one little story. Another story, which is a little bigger, short, but big, is we spent 2 years in France fighting in parliament to pass legislation to fight anti-Semitism and to adopt IRA, and it was led by a Catholic member of parliament, brand new, who decided to take this on, set up a committee to fight anti-Semitism that didn't exist, recruited members of parliament to join that committee, took them to Israel with Elnet, drafted the legislation working with Yad Vashem and with Elnet, went back to the parliament, lobbied and lobbied and lobbied, and 2 years later this passed. And today we look at France, and they're officially on the record fighting anti-Semitism. It's state law led by the parliament and the executive, and we see it time and time again. So it's not something that you ever resolve for good, but we'll always be in the business of cultivating friends for the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and this is where we need your support. Because when the only airline flying is El Al, when a ticket used to be $700 and now it's $3,000 on economy, then you know that we have issues. And we're an organization that needs to raise funds in order to continue sending people to Israel. It's that simple. So please join us. Please be part of the vision that Larry began 15, 17 years ago with Jewish leaders in Europe and other leaders here, and many of you in this room were there at the creation of this org. This is an LA creation, my friends. So be part of it. What? Yes, this is an LA organization. So it's yours. So take us on and support this enormous effort. Thank you very much. Am Yisrael Chai.
Somewhere safer.
You're so good at this. Yeah, right here. Good.